On the morning of September 14, 1851, workers arriving at the Hapeville cotton processing facility in southern Georgia discovered their overseer lying beneath the massive iron press, his skull crushed beyond recognition. The machine's wheel had been turned exactly 17 times, enough pressure to compress 200 pounds of raw cotton into a single bale, or to reduce a human head to less than 3 inches thick. What made this death particularly disturbing wasn't just the brutality, but what the county sheriff found 3 days later: a small wooden step stool positioned perfectly beside the press, built for someone no taller than 4 feet. The murder weapon had been operated by a child. But not just any child. According to plantation records discovered in 1923 and immediately sealed by the Georgia Historical Society, the boy responsible had been purchased 8 months earlier for 8 cents, the price of a damaged tool. His name appears in only one document, his crime in none of the official records, and his fate remains one of the most deliberately obscured cases in antebellum Georgia history. What happened in that cotton press facility reveals something far more terrible than murder. Before we continue with the story of Hapeville's forgotten atrocity, I need to ask you something. This story contains truths that were buried for over a century, facts that powerful families spent generations trying to erase. If you're ready to hear what really happened in the shadows of Georgia's cotton empire, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. And I'm curious. Comment below and tell me what state or city you're listening from. Are you in the South? Do you live near where these events unfolded? Let's discover together what the history books refuse to tell us. The story truly begins, not with violence, but with commerce. The kind of cold, calculated business that treated human beings as livestock and measured their worth in fractions of a dollar. Hapeville in 1851 existed as little more than a crossroads, a collection of structures serving the cotton economy that dominated Georgia like a white-flowered plague. The town itself consisted of 23 buildings, 2 churches, 1 general store, a blacksmith's shop, and the rest. Homes of plantation owners who spent most of their time at their rural properties, coming to Hapeville only for business transactions or Sunday worship. But the true heart of Hapeville was the cotton facility, a sprawling complex of warehouses and processing equipment where raw cotton from surrounding plantations was compressed, weighed, and prepared for shipment to the textile mills of New England and England. The facility belonged to Cyrus Gantry, a man whose wealth came not from growing cotton, but from handling it, charging plantation owners for processing and storage, taking his percentage from every bale that passed through his machines. Gantry had inherited the business from his father in 1847 and had expanded it considerably, installing new presses imported from Philadelphia and hiring additional workers to handle the increased volume. He was 34 years old in 1851, married with 3 daughters, and considered himself a reasonable man who ran his operation efficiently and profitably. The processing facility operated year-round, but the true frenzy came during harvest season, August through October, when wagon after wagon arrived loaded with raw cotton, and the presses ran from dawn until well past midnight. The work was brutal, lifting, sorting, feeding the massive mechanical presses, operating the baling equipment, loading finished bales onto railway cars. Most of this labor was performed by enslaved men and women, 37 of them owned by Gantry, specifically for the facility's operation. One of Gantry's overseers was Tobias Stroud, a man of 41 years who had worked at the facility for nearly a decade. Stroud was known for his efficiency and his cruelty in equal measure. The enslaved workers feared him more than Gantry himself, and with good reason. Stroud believed in correction through pain, a philosophy he applied liberally with a leather strap he kept coiled at his belt. He lived in a small house adjacent to the facility, close enough to hear if work slowed during the night shifts, close enough to respond immediately to any disruption in productivity. Stroud had never married. His life was the facility, the machines, the constant rhythm of cotton being transformed from raw bolls into compressed bales worth their weight in gold. He took pride in the numbers, in the efficiency of his operation, in his ability to extract maximum productivity from the workers under his control. He kept meticulous records of every bale processed, every hour worked, every instance of what he called defiance that required correction. But Tobias Stroud had a peculiarity that others noticed but rarely mentioned. He collected, not valuable things, not coins or jewelry or art. He collected the broken and damaged, the objects others discarded. His small house was filled with cracked pottery he'd mended, clocks that no longer kept proper time but still ticked, furniture with missing legs propped up with wooden blocks. He found value, he told the few who asked, in things others considered worthless. This philosophy extended beyond objects. In February of 1851, a slave auction took place in Hapeville, not a large affair, just the liquidation of an estate after its owner, Nathaniel Vickers, had died suddenly of apoplexy. His widow was returning to her family in South Carolina and wished to settle all accounts before departing Georgia. The auction was held on a cold Saturday morning in front of the general store, with perhaps 40 men gathered to examine the merchandise and place their bids. Most of the enslaved people sold that day fetched expected prices. Young men in their prime went for $1,200 to $1,500, women of childbearing age for slightly less, children for $500 to $700 depending on their age and apparent health. But there was one lot that drew uncomfortable laughter and dismissive comments from the assembled buyers. Lot number 17 was a boy, listed in the auction document as approximately 11 years old, name recorded only as Small Thomas. The auctioneer's description was brutally clinical. Dwarf Negro boy, approximate height 3 feet 9 inches, proportions irregular, left arm shorter than right, spine curved, feet turned inward, has been employed in light household tasks, understands English, generally obedient. The boy stood on the auction block wearing clothes several sizes too large, his head barely reaching the auctioneer's waist. His condition was immediately apparent to everyone present. What we would now recognize as a form of dwarfism, likely achondroplasia, combined with additional complications that affected his limbs and spine. In 1851, such conditions were little understood and often attributed to maternal sin or divine punishment. The enslaved community often protected such individuals, finding them work suited to their abilities. But to slave owners, they represented a calculation, the cost of feeding and housing someone against their potential productivity. The bidding for Small Thomas opened at $50. There were no takers. The auctioneer dropped to $30. Still nothing. At $10, a few men chuckled. At $5, someone suggested the boy might be useful for scaring crows from a field. At $1, the auctioneer's voice carried frustration and a desire to simply complete the sale and move on to more profitable lots. 8 cents, Tobias Stroud called out from the back of the crowd. The laughter stopped. Men turned to stare at Stroud, trying to understand if he was mocking the process or making a legitimate offer. 8 cents was what one might pay for a pound of nails or a small bag of seed. It was not a price associated with a human being, even one considered damaged. 8 cents, Stroud repeated, walking forward through the crowd. That's my bid. The auctioneer looked to the estate executor, who simply shrugged. The widow wanted everything sold, every debt settled, every piece of property converted to cash for her departure. Sold, the auctioneer declared, his voice flat with distaste, to Tobias Stroud for 8 cents. Stroud paid the money immediately, pulling out 8 copper pennies from his coat pocket and placing them in the auctioneer's hand one at a time, letting each coin clink against the others. Then he walked to the auction block, looked down at Small Thomas, and spoke in a voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. You're mine now. You'll work at the cotton facility. You'll do what I tell you when I tell you, and you'll do it well, do you understand? The boy nodded once, his dark eyes meeting Stroud's for just a moment before dropping to the ground. Those who witnessed the exchange would later remember that moment, would remember the boy's expression as unreadable, not fearful, not defiant, simply blank, as if something behind his eyes had gone dark. Stroud led his new acquisition through the streets of Hapeville, the boy struggling to keep pace with his uneven gait, his twisted feet making each step a visible effort. They arrived at the cotton facility just as the afternoon shift was beginning, the sound of machinery already filling the air with its rhythmic thunder. "This here is what I paid 8 cents for," Stroud announced to the workers in the main processing area, his hand gripping the boy's shoulder. "But even things bought cheap have use. He's small enough to crawl into spaces you can't reach, to clean under the machines, to fetch tools from tight spots. His fingers work fine, I seen that much. So he'll earn his keep, same as all of you." What Stroud didn't announce, what he kept to himself in those first weeks, was his real motivation for the purchase. Yes, the boy could fit into small spaces. Yes, there was practical value in that. But there was something else. Something that satisfied a need Stroud himself probably didn't fully understand. The ownership of something broken, something he could shape and control absolutely. Something that proved his belief that even the most damaged thing had value, if only you knew how to extract it. Small Thomas was given a corner in the facility's storage barn where other workers slept, provided with a thin blanket and a wooden crate for his few possessions. He was fed the same rations as the others: cornmeal, occasionally salt pork, sometimes molasses. The work began immediately. Crawling beneath the massive presses to retrieve dropped tools or cotton fragments, cleaning the thick grease from gears that regular-sized workers couldn't reach, fetching water in buckets he had to grip with both hands because of his proportions. The other enslaved workers showed him kindness when Stroud wasn't watching. A woman named Bess, who cooked for the facility workers, would save him extra portions of food, slipping them to him when she could. An elderly man called Prophet, who maintained the equipment, showed him which machines were most dangerous, which spaces to avoid, how to tell when a press was about to engage its mechanisms. They tried to shelter him, these people who had their own burdens, their own daily struggles for survival. But Tobias Stroud watched everything. In the months that followed, Stroud developed what he called a training program for the boy. It began with simple tasks performed under observation, Stroud timing each one with a pocket watch, recording the results in a small leather notebook he kept. If the boy completed a task in the expected time, he received his full ration that evening. If he failed to meet the standard, the ration was reduced. This was the first level of control: hunger as motivation. The second level came in April, 2 months after the purchase. Stroud had a wooden sign made, crude letters burned into a pine board. 8-cent boy. He hung this sign around Thomas's neck with a leather cord, forcing him to wear it during all working hours. When other enslaved people objected, suggesting it was needlessly cruel even by the standards of the facility, Stroud's response was chilling in its logic. He needs to know his value, so he can appreciate that I'm giving him the chance to prove he's worth more. When he's earned back his purchase price in productivity, I'll take the sign off, not before. By Stroud's calculations, at 8 cents, with the boy's limited capabilities, the sign would remain around his neck for approximately 7 years. This assumed, of course, that the boy survived that long. Many didn't think he would. The work was hard, the conditions harsh, and children, especially those with physical complications, often succumbed to illness, injury, or simple exhaustion. But small Thomas survived. More than that, he adapted. He learned to move through the facility with surprising speed, despite his disability, his uneven gait becoming almost rhythmic as he navigated between machines and workers. He learned which tasks he could perform quickly, which required more time, how to anticipate Stroud's demands before they were voiced. He learned to make himself useful in ways that went beyond Stroud's original intentions, and this, perhaps, was his first mistake, because Tobias Stroud noticed everything. And what he noticed by the summer of 1851 was that the boy he'd purchased for 8 cents was proving to be more valuable than anticipated. Small Thomas could indeed fit into spaces no one else could reach, but he'd also developed an understanding of the machinery itself, how the presses worked, how the gears meshed, which bolts needed tightening, which parts were wearing down and needed attention. Prophet had taught him well, perhaps too well. In late July, during the early phase of the harvest season, a mechanical problem threatened to shut down the main cotton press for several days. One of the drive chains had broken and fallen into the gear mechanism deep inside the press housing, a space too small for any adult to access, too dangerous to disassemble the entire machine when cotton was arriving by the wagon load and plantation owners were demanding quick turnaround. Stroud looked at the problem, looked at small Thomas, and saw his solution. "Boy," he said, his voice carrying that tone of command the enslaved workers knew meant absolute obedience was required. "You're going in there to get that chain. I'll walk you through what you need to do." Prophet had stepped forward then, his old face creased with concern. "Mr. Stroud, sir, that space ain't safe. If someone was to engage the mechanism while he's inside—" "No one's going to engage nothing," Stroud snapped. "I'll be right here watching." Boy goes in, retrieves the chain, comes back out. Simple. It wasn't simple. The space inside the press housing was barely large enough for the boy's body, requiring him to crawl on his stomach through gaps between iron plates and wooden frames, all coated in thick grease and cotton lint. The heat inside was suffocating, the air thick with oil fumes. And everywhere, just inches from his body, were the massive gears and plates that, if activated, would crush him instantly. But small Thomas crawled inside. Following Stroud's shouted instructions, he worked for nearly an hour in that mechanical darkness, his twisted hands fumbling with the heavy chain, trying to work it free from where it had lodged. The other workers stood in absolute silence, barely breathing, listening to the sounds of metal scraping metal, the boy's labored breathing, Stroud's voice directing every movement. When small Thomas finally emerged, covered in black grease, the chain clutched in his hands, dragging it behind him like a prisoner's shackle. Something had changed in his expression. The blankness was still there, but underneath it, those who looked closely might have seen something else, a calculation, an awareness, a kind of knowledge that came from spending an hour inches away from the machinery that could end his life with a single lever pull. Stroud had taken the chain, examined it, then looked down at the boy. "See? You're worth more than 8 cents after all. Keep proving it, and maybe that sign comes off sooner than I thought." But he didn't remove the sign. Not then. Not in the weeks that followed, even as the boy continued to prove useful, continued to perform tasks others couldn't, continued to crawl into dangerous spaces to retrieve dropped tools or clear jammed mechanisms. The sign remained, a constant reminder. 8 cents. That's what you are. That's all you'll ever be unless I decide otherwise. By early September, the harvest season was at its peak. The facility operated around the clock, with workers sleeping in shifts, the machines never stopping, the smell of cotton and sweat and machine oil creating a fog that hung over Hapeville like morning mist. Stroud himself barely slept, moving through the facility at all hours, checking productivity, demanding faster work, using his leather strap when he felt workers were slowing down. Small Thomas had been assigned to the night shift, working from sunset until dawn, primarily maintaining the area around the main press where Stroud himself usually stationed during the busiest hours. The boy would fetch water, clean the work area, remove cotton debris, and, increasingly, be called upon to make minor adjustments to the machinery when something seemed off. It was during these night shifts, when the facility was lit only by oil lanterns and the work took on a hypnotic, exhausting rhythm, that the other workers noticed small Thomas watching the press. Not just glancing at it, but studying it with an intensity that seemed unusual for someone so young. He would stand in the shadows, his small form barely visible, his eyes tracking the movement of the great iron plates, the turning of the screw mechanism, the way the pressure built slowly and then released over and over all night long. Prophet had noticed. On a break one night in early September, he'd pulled the boy aside, speaking quietly in the dialect of the enslaved, words that could be passed off as harmless if overheard, but carried meaning to those who understood. "Child, you got to be careful what you think about. Some thoughts, they grow like poison oak. Start small, but they spread. Cover everything. Choke out what's good." Small Thomas had looked up at him, and for just a moment the blankness had cracked. How much pressure it take? The boy had asked, his voice soft, the first words Prophet had heard him speak in weeks. To crush cotton down to a bale? Prophet's blood had gone cold. More than you want to know about. More than you should be thinking about. Just wondering, the boy had said, and the blankness had returned, smooth as water over stones. 3 days later, on the morning of September 14th, 1851, Tobias Stroud was found dead beneath the main cotton press. The discovery came at dawn, when the morning shift workers arrived to relieve those who'd worked through the night. The facility should have been full of activity, but instead they found an unusual silence. The main press had been shut down, its massive mechanism frozen mid-cycle. Oil lamps still burned at their stations, casting flickering shadows across walls stained with years of cotton dust. And there, beneath the press itself, visible in the growing morning light streaming through the high windows, was Tobias Stroud, or what remained of him. His body was positioned on the press bed, the massive iron plate suspended approximately 3 inches above where his head should have been. The word should is crucial here, because Tobias Stroud no longer had a head in any recognizable sense. The press plate had come down with such force and been worked with such methodical precision that what lay beneath was little more than a dark stain spreading across the cotton batting used as cushioning for the bales. Samuel Rutledge, the plantation owner who arrived with that first morning shift, would later testify that he couldn't look at it direct for more than a second. The body below the neck appeared untouched. Stroud's clothes were intact, his arms at his sides, his legs straight. But above the shoulders was simply absence. The iron plate rested on the press bed itself, with perhaps half an inch of organic matter spread between metal and wood, compressed with such thoroughness that nothing remained in 3 dimensions. What made the scene even more disturbing was its precision. This was not a clumsy accident, not someone caught by surprise when machinery engaged unexpectedly. The press had been operated with care, with knowledge, with an understanding of exactly how many turns of the great wheel were needed to achieve complete compression. Someone had positioned Stroud on the press bed, whether through force, unconsciousness, or deception wasn't immediately clear, and then had worked the mechanism with deliberate intent. The wheel itself showed signs of this deliberation. The cotton press operated by manual labor. 2 men would typically turn the large wooden wheel that engaged an iron screw mechanism, building pressure slowly but inexorably, compressing the raw cotton into the dense bales required for shipping. It took strength and coordination, but more than that, it took knowledge. Understanding when to stop, how to release the pressure, how to reset the mechanism. This wheel had been turned 17 times, they would later determine by counting the position of marks on the screw mechanism. Each complete rotation added thousands of pounds of pressure. After 10 rotations, cotton was compressed to half its original volume. After 15, it became dense as hardwood, the fibers crushed together into something barely resembling the soft bolls that had arrived from the fields. After 17 rotations, the pressure was sufficient to drive every ounce of air, every drop of moisture, every hint of softness from whatever was caught beneath that iron plate. But here was the detail that would obsess the investigation. The wheel was positioned nearly 8 feet off the ground, its handles designed for men of average height to grip and turn with their full body weight. How had someone short enough to require a step stool managed to apply the force necessary to turn it 17 times? The answer was found 3 feet from the press. A wooden step stool, carefully constructed from scrap lumber, its surface showing scuff marks and indentations consistent with someone standing on it repeatedly, shifting their weight, using it as a platform to reach the wheel handles. But this stool was built low, barely 15 inches high. Whoever had used it to operate the press stood no taller than 4 feet. Sheriff Edmund Howell arrived at the facility within an hour of the body's discovery. Howell was 60 years old, a veteran of frontier law enforcement who'd seen violence in many forms during his decades serving Georgia's rural counties. But even he, according to his report filed with the county clerk, found the scene to present circumstances most disturbing to contemplate. His initial assessment focused on the obvious questions. Who had been working the night shift? Where were those workers now? Who had access to the facility during the hours when this must have occurred? The answers came quickly, but they brought more questions. The night shift had consisted of 12 enslaved workers, supervised by Tobias Stroud himself. This was standard during harvest season. Stroud often took night supervision personally, believing the workers needed his presence to maintain productivity during the exhausting overnight hours. According to the workers now being questioned, Stroud had been alive and active until approximately 3 in the morning, when he'd made his usual rounds of the facility, checking each station, noting productivity in his leather notebook. After that point, accounts grew hazier. The work was hypnotic, exhausting, the kind that made time stretch and contract strangely. Men would work for what felt like an hour and discover only 20 minutes had passed. Or the reverse, in the flickering lamplight, with the constant noise of machinery, the counting of bales, the rhythmic movements of labor, it was entirely possible for someone to disappear for an hour without being immediately missed. What the workers could confirm was that Small Thomas, and this is when the sheriff first learned about the 8-cent purchase, the sign still found lying near the boy's sleeping corner, had been assigned to the main press area that night. His job was to keep the area clean, to fetch water for the men operating the press, to clear cotton debris, to assist with minor mechanical issues. "Where is this boy now?" Sheriff Howell had asked. No one knew. His sleeping corner in the storage barn was empty. His blanket was folded neatly, the wooden sign with 8-cent boy burned into it lying on top of the crate that held his few possessions. A tin cup, a worn shirt too large for his frame, a small smooth river stone that Prophet said the boy had found and kept for reasons unknown. The search began immediately. 20 men spread through Hapeville and the surrounding countryside, checking barns, searching wooded areas, questioning anyone who might have seen a small boy traveling alone. In 1851 Georgia, an enslaved person moving without papers, without permission, without a white person's authorization, was immediately suspect. And a child with obvious physical disabilities would be even more noticeable, unable to blend into a crowd or move quickly through terrain. But Small Thomas had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed him. While the search continued, Sheriff Howell examined the crime scene with increasing unease. The more he studied it, the less it made sense. The positioning of Stroud's body suggested he'd either been unconscious when placed on the press or had been somehow convinced to lie there voluntarily. But why would Stroud, a man known for his suspicion and control, allow himself to be placed in such a vulnerable position? The press mechanism showed signs of careful operation. This wasn't frantic or panicked work. Someone had taken their time, had turned that wheel slowly and methodically, had likely watched as the pressure built, as the iron plate descended, as Tobias Stroud's life ended in what must have been both instantaneous and eternal. Dr. Marcus Fenneman, the town's physician called to examine the remains, noted in his report, death would have occurred within seconds of the cranium's collapse. However, given the evidence of progressive compression, the deceased may have experienced significant terror and pain in the moments before mortality, assuming consciousness was retained. The precision of the injury suggests deliberate intent rather than accidental engagement of machinery. On the second day after the discovery, Prophet was brought in for extended questioning. As the enslaved worker with the most knowledge of the machinery and the closest thing to a relationship with Small Thomas, he was considered a crucial witness. The questioning took place in Hapeville's one-room jail, Sheriff Howell sitting across a rough wooden table from the elderly black man, whose hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the arthritis that plagued his joints after decades of manual labor. "Tell me about the boy," Howell said, his voice neither kind nor cruel, simply matter-of-fact. "What was he like? Did he speak about Stroud? About the work?" Prophet had chosen his words carefully, knowing that anything he said could result in punishment for himself or others. "The child was quiet, sir, kept to himself mostly. did his work without complaining. Mr. Stroud, he was hard on the boy, but he was hard on everybody. Did the boy ever threaten Stroud? Ever show defiance? No, sir. Child just did what he was told. Wore that sign around his neck every day without a word of complaint. But you taught him about the machines. Howell pressed. You showed him how they worked. Prophet had felt the trap closing. Yes, sir. So he'd know how to stay safe. So he wouldn't get hurt doing the jobs Mr. Stroud gave him. Those machines, they'll kill you quick if you don't understand them. So he understood them well enough to operate them. Sir, that press requires 2 strong men to turn that wheel. The boy couldn't hardly reach it even with that stool. His arms aren't the same length. His back is twisted. He couldn't generate the force needed. This was the central contradiction that plagued the investigation. Every man who worked the facility confirmed that operating the main press required significant strength and coordination. Even with a step stool, even with knowledge of the mechanisms, how could a small boy with physical disabilities manage what typically required 2 adult men working in coordination? Sheriff Howell had stood and walked to the jail's small window, looking out at Hapeville's dusty Main Street. Unless, he'd said slowly, he wasn't working alone. Unless someone helped him, someone strong enough to turn that wheel while the boy directed the operation. The implication was clear. This wasn't the crime of a child acting alone. This was conspiracy. This was multiple enslaved people working together to murder their overseer. And in 1851, Georgia, such an accusation carried implications far beyond a single facility, a single crime. The entire social order was built on the assumption that enslaved people, however they might feel about their condition, would not organize against their masters. Individual acts of defiance, yes, running away, breaking tools, working slowly, but coordinated murder. That suggested something far more dangerous to the system. Over the next week, every enslaved person who'd worked the night shift was questioned separately, their accounts compared, contradictions noted. Sheriff Howell was looking for signs of collusion, evidence that this had been planned, that multiple people had been involved. He was particularly interested in the hours between 3 a.m., when Stroud was last seen alive by multiple witnesses, and dawn, when the body was discovered. But the accounts were frustratingly consistent. Everyone had been at their assigned stations, working continuously, focused on meeting the quotas that Stroud himself had set. No one had seen anything unusual. No one had heard anything beyond the normal sounds of machinery and labor. And critically, no one admitted to seeing Small Thomas during those crucial hours, even though he should have been visible in the press area, performing his assigned duties. It was as if the boy had become invisible during the exact period when Tobias Stroud was being positioned and crushed beneath the press that he had forced the boy to maintain, to understand, to crawl inside when chains jammed and gears failed. The sign, that wooden board with 8-cent boy burned into it, became a focal point of speculation. It had been found in the boy's sleeping area, removed from around his neck at some point during that last night. Had he taken it off himself? Had someone else removed it? And what, if anything, did that signify? Bess, the woman who cooked for the facility workers, was questioned about the boy's state of mind in the days before the murder. She'd described him as unchanged, quiet, withdrawn, obedient. But when pressed about whether he'd shown any signs of planning something, any indication of anger or resentment, she'd said something that made Sheriff Howell's blood run cold. That child never showed anger, sir. Never saw him cry, neither. He was like a bucket with all the water drained out. Just empty. But he watched things. Watched the machines, mostly. Studied them like some men study scripture. Like he was looking for answers in all those gears and wheels and plates. Answers to what? Howell had asked. How things work, I suppose. How pressure builds. How things break. She'd paused, then added, how something small can move something big, if you understand the right way to apply force. This was as close to an accusation as anyone would come. The code was clear. Bess was telling him without saying it directly that the boy had been planning something. Studying the machinery not to maintain it, but to understand it as a weapon. But where was he now? How had a child with a distinctive appearance and physical limitations vanished so completely in a rural county where everyone knew everyone, where strangers were immediately noted, where the enslaved population was constantly monitored? The search expanded. Notices were posted in surrounding counties. Slave catchers were hired to scour the woods and back roads. The reward for his capture started at $10, more than 100 times what Tobias Stroud had paid for him, and eventually rose to $50 as the days passed without any sign of the boy. And then, on September 22nd, 8 days after the murder, a discovery was made that changed everything. A farmer named Josiah Teague, working his land roughly 8 miles northeast of Hapeville, found something unusual while clearing brush near Redemption Creek, a shallow waterway that wound through the county before joining larger rivers that eventually reached the Atlantic. The creek was low due to the summer drought, revealing a sandbar that was normally submerged, and on this sandbar, Teague discovered a set of child-sized footprints preserved in dried mud. But these weren't normal footprints. They were irregular. The left foot turned inward, the right appearing to drag slightly, exactly consistent with Small Thomas's documented disability. The prints led from the creek bank into the water, then disappeared where the current had presumably carried them away. Following the tracks backward, Teague discovered a small hollow beneath the exposed roots of a massive oak tree, a space barely large enough for a child to crawl into, and inside this hollow, the torn remnants of a shirt, definitely too large for whoever had worn it, and a single copper penny pressed into the soft earth as if someone had clutched it tightly before letting it fall. Sheriff Howell arrived at the site within hours, bringing Prophet with him to confirm the significance of what had been found. The old man had examined the footprints carefully, his face impassive, then confirmed what Howell already suspected. "That's the boy's walking pattern, sir. Can't be nobody else." The timeline that emerged was chilling in its implications. The tracks and the hollow suggested that Small Thomas had reached this location sometime during the night of the murder or early the following morning, a distance of 8 miles from Hapeville, covered by a child with severe mobility limitations, moving through darkness across unfamiliar terrain. But the tracks led into the creek and disappeared. Had the boy drowned, his body swept downstream by the current? It was the most logical conclusion, one that Sheriff Howell began to embrace almost immediately. A child fleeing in panic, without understanding the danger of the creek, wading in too deep, swept away by water that appeared calm but hid dangerous undercurrents. Yet something about this conclusion troubled those who knew the creek. Redemption Creek was shallow. Even at its deepest point in the spring floods, it barely reached 5 feet. During the September drought, it was more like 2 or 3 feet, hardly enough to pose a serious threat even to a small child. And the current, while present, was gentle enough that drowning seemed unlikely. An alternative theory emerged. Perhaps the boy had used the creek deliberately, wading through shallow water to hide his scent from tracking dogs, then emerging somewhere downstream where his tracks wouldn't be found. It was a level of calculation that seemed beyond a child's capabilities, yet the evidence supported it. The copper penny troubled Sheriff Howell most. Why would someone fleeing for their life pause to leave a coin pressed into the earth? Was it dropped accidentally or placed intentionally? And if intentionally, what did it signify? When Howell showed the penny to Cyrus Gantry, the facility owner's face had gone pale. He'd recognized it immediately, not the specific coin, but its significance. Stroud paid 8 pennies for that boy. 8 cents. He used to mock him about it, tell him he wasn't worth more than pocket change. Gantry's hands had shaken slightly as he held the coin. Do you think the boy left this as some kind of message? Like he was returning what he was bought for? It was a disturbing thought, one that suggested premeditation, symbolic thinking, a level of consciousness about his own commodification that made the crime feel less like panic and more like statement. A child capable of that kind of abstract revenge was a child who had been thinking, planning, calculating for months. The search continued for 3 more weeks, but no trace of Small Thomas was ever found. The creek was dragged for miles downstream. Every farm, every shed, every cave within 20 miles was searched. Slave catchers brought their best dogs, but the scent trail ended at the water's edge and never picked up again. By mid-October, as the harvest season wound down and the facility returned to normal operations, Sheriff Howell closed his investigation with a report that satisfied no one. The official conclusion: Tobias Stroud had been murdered by person or persons unknown, likely including the enslaved boy called Small Thomas, who had subsequently perished while fleeing the scene, his body lost to Redemption Creek. But Howell's private notes, discovered years later in his estate papers, told a different story. "I do not believe the child drowned," he wrote. "The evidence suggests calculation beyond his years, assistance beyond what any witness will admit, and an escape planned with care. Someone helped him. Someone who knew the land, who understood how to disappear, who had reason to want both Stroud dead and the boy free. I cannot prove this, and in truth I am not certain I wish to. Justice in this case may have been served outside the law. The mystery of what really happened that night in September 1851 has never been solved. But before we explore what came next, the consequences that rippled through Hapeville and beyond, I want to hear from you. Do you think Small Thomas acted alone? Could a child really have the strength and knowledge to operate that press? Drop your theories in the comments below, and if this story is keeping you on edge, hit that like button and share it with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. Now, let's discover what Hapeville tried so desperately to bury. The death of Tobias Stroud should have sparked outrage, demands for justice, public executions as examples. Instead, what followed was something far stranger, a conspiracy of silence that spread through Hapeville like fog. In the weeks following Stroud's death, something unexpected happened in Hapeville. The story began to change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, subtly, the way a photograph fades when left in sunlight. The initial newspaper reports in the Hapeville Gazette had been detailed and lurid, describing the brutal murder by savage hands and the hunt for the monster responsible. But by late October, subsequent articles grew shorter, vaguer, less interested in the specifics. By November, the story had disappeared entirely from the local press, replaced by mundane reports of cotton prices and upcoming church socials. This wasn't accidental. Cyrus Gantry had quietly approached the newspaper's editor, Horace Kimball, with a proposal. The continued reporting of this incident is damaging to business confidence. Plantation owners are nervous about sending their cotton to a facility associated with murder. Perhaps it would be better for everyone if we allowed this unfortunate matter to fade from public attention. The amount of money that changed hands was never recorded, but Kimball's sudden ability to upgrade his printing press that winter suggested the conversation had been profitable. But Gantry's motivation wasn't just business protection. There was something else, something that bothered him about the whole affair. In the weeks after Stroud's death, as he'd gone through his overseer's personal effects, Gantry had discovered Stroud's notebook, the leather-bound journal where he'd recorded every detail of the facility's operations, every worker's productivity, every instance of what he called correction. The notebook's final entries disturbed Gantry deeply. In the weeks before his death, Stroud had become obsessed with Small Thomas, filling pages with observations about the boy's capabilities, his understanding of machinery, his movements through the facility. But the tone had shifted from the clinical documentation of earlier entries to something darker, more personal. August 29th, the 8-cent boy completed retrieval from press housing in 42 minutes, 7 minutes faster than previous attempt. His understanding of the mechanisms continues to exceed expectations. I believe I have found something remarkable in this damaged creature. With proper training, he may prove my thesis, that value exists even in what others discard. September 3rd, observed the boy watching the main press during night operations. His focus was absolute, studying each rotation of the wheel, each engagement of the screw mechanism. When questioned, he claimed simple curiosity. I do not believe him. There is calculation behind those eyes. September 8th, The boy asked me today how much force the press generates at full compression. I told him enough to compact 500 pounds of cotton into a 200-pound bale. He nodded and said nothing more, but I saw him counting on his fingers afterward, doing arithmetic in his head. What is he calculating? The final entry was dated September 13th, the night before Stroud's death. I have made a decision regarding the 8-cent boy. His productivity has exceeded all expectations. Tomorrow, I will remove the sign from his neck and inform him that he has earned back his purchase price through his labor. I believe this will provide motivation for continued excellence. Perhaps I will even teach him to read and write. A damaged tool, properly maintained, can serve for years. Gantry had stared at that final entry for a long time, trying to understand its implications. Stroud had planned to free the boy from the humiliation of that sign, had planned to reward him, had perhaps even planned to treat him with something approaching kindness. And yet the very next night, Stroud was dead beneath the press, and the boy had vanished. Had Small Thomas known about Stroud's intention? Had someone told him, thinking it would be welcome news? And if so, why would he choose that exact night to commit murder, when his situation was about to improve? Unless the boy hadn't believed it. Unless 8 months of degradation, of being valued at less than a pound of nails, of wearing that sign every day while performing the most dangerous and demeaning work, unless all of that had created a debt that couldn't be forgiven with a simple gesture of mercy. Unless the damage went deeper than Stroud had ever understood. Gantry had burned the notebook. He told no one about its contents, not Sheriff Howell, not his wife, not the other facility owners. He simply fed it page by page into his fireplace one cold November evening and watched Tobias Stroud's careful observations turn to ash. Meanwhile, the enslaved workers at the facility had developed their own understanding of what had happened, one they shared only among themselves in the careful coded language of the oppressed. Prophet, in the months before his own death in 1853, would tell the story to younger workers, always in whispers, always with the warning that some truths are too heavy to carry in daylight. According to this version, passed down through generations, never written, never confirmed, Small Thomas hadn't acted alone that night. He'd had help, but not in the way Sheriff Howell had suspected. The help hadn't come in operating the press or subduing Stroud. It had come in the form of opportunity and silence. The story went that Stroud, in the early morning hours of September 14th, had discovered a mechanical problem with the main press, not unusual during the intense harvest season. He'd called for Small Thomas to examine it, as he often did, valuing the boy's small size and growing mechanical knowledge. What Stroud hadn't known was that the problem had been created deliberately. A bolt loosened just enough to cause a vibration in the mechanism, noticeable to someone as obsessive about his machinery as Stroud. While Stroud bent over the press bed, examining the source of the problem with a lantern, explaining what he was looking for, the boy had simply acted. A push wasn't needed. Stroud was already in position. What was needed was the wheel. And here was where the story became almost mythical in its telling. The boy had used Stroud's own body weight. The press wheel had a release mechanism, a lever that, when pulled, would cause the iron plate to drop suddenly by several inches before catching on a lower gear. It was a safety feature, designed to quickly release pressure if something went wrong. Small Thomas had pulled that lever while Stroud's head was beneath the plate, and the initial drop, perhaps 6 inches, had been enough to stun him, to pin him, to make resistance impossible. After that, turning the wheel hadn't required 2 men's strength. It had required only time, patience, and the mechanical advantage of the step stool the boy had built over weeks from scrap lumber, hidden in plain sight among the facility's clutter. 17 turns. Approximately an hour of work, turning the wheel a quarter rotation at a time, resting, turning again, each rotation adding pressure, each adding inevitability. And the other workers? They had heard nothing unusual because the sound of the press operating was normal. They had seen nothing because they had practiced the most essential survival skill of the enslaved, the ability to not see what might get them killed for witnessing. When questioned later, they spoke truth. They had been at their stations working. They simply failed to mention that they had deliberately never looked toward the main press during those crucial hours, had deliberately focused on their own tasks with unusual intensity, had created a circle of willful blindness that allowed what needed to happen to happen. This version of events explained much: the precision of the crime, the lack of struggle, the boy's escape. But it also raised darker questions. If the other workers had known, had participated through their silence, had created the opportunity, did that make them accomplices to murder? Or was their inaction simply another form of survival in a system where resistance could mean death? By the spring of 1852, Hapeville had largely moved past the Stroud incident. The cotton facility continued operations under new management. The harvest that year was strong, and profits were good. Cyrus Gantry had hired a new overseer, a man named Duncan Talbot, who was known for being firm but fair, or at least as fair as the system allowed. But something had changed in the facility's atmosphere, something the enslaved workers felt but couldn't quite articulate. There was a sense of possibility now, a tiny crack in the absolute power that had governed their lives. Stroud's death had proven something. The system wasn't invulnerable. The masters weren't untouchable. Under the right circumstances, with enough pain, enough cause, enough calculation, resistance was possible. This didn't manifest in open rebellion, nothing so dramatic or suicidal, but in the small acts of daily life. A tool that went missing and was never found. A machine that developed mysterious problems, work that took just a bit longer than it should. Nothing provable, nothing that could be punished, but a general slowing. A quiet resistance that cost Gantry perhaps 5% of his previous productivity. Not enough to be catastrophic, but enough to be noticed. Talbot, the new overseer, was smart enough to recognize what was happening. He'd lived his entire life in the South, understood the delicate balance of coercion and cooperation that made the system function. He knew that Stroud's mistake hadn't been cruelty. Cruelty was expected, built into the system, but rather the personal nature of his cruelty, the way he'd singled out individuals for special humiliation. So Talbot maintained discipline through routine rather than spite, through established rules rather than capricious punishment. He never made anyone wear a sign. He never mocked anyone for their physical appearance. He ran the facility efficiently, profitably, and with the minimum violence necessary to maintain control. And in doing so, he ensured that the memory of Tobias Stroud faded even further, became just another story of a man who'd pushed too hard and paid the price. But there was one person who couldn't let it go. Stroud's widow, Margaret, who had moved back to her family in Virginia after her husband's death. She had inherited nothing from Stroud. He'd died without a will, and his assets had been minimal anyway, most of his income having gone to gambling debts she'd known nothing about. But she'd inherited his questions, his unfinished business, his ghost. In the summer of 1852, Margaret hired a private investigator named Chester Wardle, paying him with the last of her widow's settlement to discover what really happened to her husband. Wardle was an unusual character for the time, a former Pinkerton agent who'd left the agency after a disagreement about methods and now worked independently, taking cases that interested him regardless of their profitability. What interested Wardle about the Stroud case wasn't the murder itself. He'd investigated dozens of killings in his career, but rather the elaborate silence that surrounded it. In my experience, he wrote to Margaret, when everyone agrees on a story, it's usually because they've agreed to lie. Wardle spent 6 weeks in Hapeville and the surrounding county, interviewing anyone who would talk to him, examining records, visiting the crime scene repeatedly. His methods were thorough and often unorthodox. He spoke to enslaved workers when their masters weren't present, paid informants in the white community for gossip, spent long hours simply observing the cotton facility's operations. His final report to Margaret, dated August 15, 1852, was devastating in its conclusions. I believe your husband was indeed murdered by the boy called Small Thomas, likely with the tacit cooperation of other enslaved workers at the facility. However, I must tell you that in investigating your husband's treatment of his workers, I discovered patterns of behavior that, while legal under current law, were extraordinarily cruel, even by the standards of this institution. The boy in question was subjected to deliberate humiliation and degradation, was forced into dangerous situations repeatedly, and was treated as less than human even among a population already denied humanity by law. I cannot condone murder, but I can understand it. Your husband created the circumstances of his own death. The report continued with details that made Margaret weep, not from grief, but from shame. Descriptions of Stroud's collection of damaged people and objects, accounts of the sign he'd forced the boy to wear, testimony about the dangerous work he'd assigned to a child with physical disabilities. She'd known her husband was involved in the slave trade, of course. Every white person in the South was, directly or indirectly. But she hadn't known the specific cruelties, the personal nature of his mistreatment. Wardell's report ended with a statement that Margaret would carry with her for the rest of her life. The boy, Small Thomas, almost certainly died in Redemption Creek or shortly after crossing it. His body was likely never found because it was buried by someone who knew the land, someone who wanted him to rest in peace rather than be returned to bondage or hanged for his crime. Whoever helped him escape performed an act of mercy in a system that allows no mercy. I recommend you let this matter rest. Your husband is gone. The boy is gone. Further investigation will only bring pain to everyone involved, including yourself. Margaret took Wardell's advice. She burned his report and never spoke of the matter again. When she died in 1871, her personal papers contained no reference to Tobias Stroud, no mention of Hapeville, nothing to suggest she'd ever been married to the man who was crushed beneath a cotton press in September of 1851. But she did leave one curious item, a small leather pouch containing 7 copper pennies wrapped in a note that read simply, "A debt unpaid." The truth about what happened to Small Thomas after he disappeared into Redemption Creek may never be fully known. But the ripples of that September night continued to spread through Georgia's history in ways no one expected. If this story is sending chills down your spine, share it with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content and subscribe to never miss stories like this. Because what we're about to discover next will change everything you thought you knew about this case. Just when the story seemed to have ended, when everyone involved had either died or moved on, a discovery in 1889 would force historians to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the 8-cent boy. In March of 1889, a remarkable event occurred that would briefly resurrect the long-forgotten story of Tobias Stroud's murder. A crew of workers building a new railroad line through what had once been the outskirts of Hapeville, now absorbed into Atlanta's growing sprawl, made a discovery that shocked everyone involved. Approximately 12 miles from the original cotton facility, in an area that had been dense forest in 1851 but was now being cleared for development, the workers found a small cabin hidden in a hollow. The structure was collapsing, nearly reclaimed by the woods, but inside, preserved by the dry conditions and protected from the elements, they found human remains. The skeleton was small, obviously a child or young person, and showed signs of severe skeletal abnormalities consistent with dwarfism and spinal curvature. Next to the remains, a rusted tin cup, the rotted fragments of what had once been clothing, and most remarkably, a small wooden box containing 8 copper pennies arranged in a perfect circle. The discovery made the newspapers, and older residents of the area remembered the Stroud case. Sheriff Howell had been dead for 15 years by then, but his successor, Harold Vesper, ordered an examination of the remains. The county's new physician, Dr. Lawrence Brennan, estimated the skeleton had been in the cabin for 30 to 40 years, consistent with the 1851 timeline. But here was the mystery. The cabin itself showed signs of having been lived in, not just used as a hiding place. There were crude shelves, a stone circle for a fire, evidence of cooking, indications that someone had survived there for perhaps weeks or even months. The location was brilliant, remote enough to avoid discovery, but close enough to the railroad line, which had existed since the 1840s, that someone could have walked to it with great difficulty in a night or two of hard travel. Dr. Brennan's report raised more questions than it answered. The skeletal remains show no signs of violence or trauma beyond the pre-existing conditions. The individual appears to have died of natural causes, possibly exposure or illness. However, the arrangement of the pennies suggests deliberate placement, possibly a burial ritual performed by someone else. This raises the possibility that the deceased did not die immediately upon reaching this location, but survived for some time, possibly with assistance. The implication was staggering. Small Thomas hadn't drowned in Redemption Creek. He'd escaped, had reached this hidden cabin, had survived there for an unknown period before eventually succumbing to illness, exposure, or simply the complications of his physical condition. And someone had known about it, had perhaps helped him, had certainly buried him with those 8 pennies arranged in their symbolic circle. The exact amount Tobias Stroud had paid for him returned to him in death as a kind of strange dignity. But who had helped him? Who had known about this cabin? Who had provided the supplies that allowed him to survive those first crucial weeks? The answer came from an unexpected source. Among those who read about the discovery was an elderly black woman named Patience Freeman, who at age 76 was one of the oldest former slaves still living in the area. She'd been freed during the Civil War and had worked as a seamstress in Atlanta for decades, never speaking much about her past. But when she read about the cabin and the 8 pennies, she walked into the offices of the Atlanta Constitution and asked to speak to a reporter. What she told him became one of the most remarkable oral histories of the period, recorded in detail and preserved in the newspaper's archives. Patience had been a young woman in 1851, enslaved on a plantation adjacent to Hapeville. She'd known Small Thomas slightly, had seen him at the facility when she'd delivered food supplies, had noticed the sign around his neck, had felt the particular pain that comes from watching a child be degraded for something beyond his control. On the morning after Stroud's death, as the search was beginning, Patience had been working in a field near Redemption Creek when she'd seen something impossible. Small Thomas, soaking wet, emerging from the water miles from where his tracks had later been found. He'd been walking upstream, using the water to hide his scent and trail, moving with painful slowness but with absolute determination. Patience had made a choice in that moment, one that could have gotten her killed or sold away if discovered. She'd hidden the boy in a drainage culvert, covered him with brush, and told him to wait. Then she'd returned to her work, said nothing to anyone, and waited for nightfall. That night, she'd stolen food from her master's stores, a risk she described as worth taking, and had led the boy through the woods to a cabin she knew about. It had been built years earlier by a fugitive slave who'd lived there for months before being captured and returned to bondage. Most people had forgotten about it, but Patience had remembered. She'd left him there with enough food for a week and a promise to return when she could. She'd made 2 more trips over the following month, each time risking everything to bring supplies: dried meat, cornmeal, a blanket, a tin cup. But on her 3rd visit, she'd found him dead, lying on the cabin floor as if asleep, the 8 pennies already arranged in their circle beside him. "I think he done it himself," she told the reporter. "Laid them pennies out before he passed, like he was saying, 'This is what I was worth to them, but I chose how I'd leave. I buried him best I could, said words over him from the Bible I'd heard in church. Then I never went back. Never told nobody until now, when everyone who could punish me for it is long dead." When asked why she'd risked so much for a child she barely knew, Patience had been silent for a long moment. Then she'd said simply, "Because somebody had to. Because that boy had been treated like he wasn't human his whole short life, and he'd done a terrible thing because of how he'd been treated, but he was still a child, still deserved a chance. So I gave him one. He didn't survive it, but at least he died free." The story of Small Thomas and Tobias Stroud faded once again after the 1889 discovery, this time permanently. The remains were buried in a pauper's cemetery. The cabin collapsed completely within a few years, and the site was eventually paved over as Atlanta continued its expansion. But the case left a mark on those who studied Georgia's antebellum history. The 8-cent purchase price, so shocking in its callous reduction of a human being to less than the cost of a tool, became a symbol of the dehumanization inherent in the slave system. Scholars debated whether Small Thomas's actions constituted murder or self-defense, whether his crime was justified by the cruelty he'd endured, whether a system that valued him at 8 cents had any moral authority to judge his response to that valuation. The cotton facility in Hapeville continued operations until 1923, when it burned down in a fire that investigators ruled accidental, but that some locals whispered had been deliberately set by descendants of the people who'd once been enslaved there. The site was never rebuilt. Today it's a parking lot, unmarked and unremarkable, with no historical marker to indicate what happened there in September of 1851. Cyrus Gantry's descendants eventually sold off all their holdings in Georgia and moved to Boston, where they became involved in the textile industry, profiting from Southern cotton without the moral complications of slave ownership. They never spoke publicly about their family's connection to the case. The most enduring legacy of the story came from an unexpected source: oral histories collected during the 1930s Federal Writers Project, which interviewed former slaves about their experiences. Several elderly individuals from Georgia told versions of the Small Thomas story, always with variations, always with the acknowledgement that they weren't sure what was true and what was legend. But certain elements remained consistent: the 8-cent price, the sign around his neck, the cotton press, and the final escape. One former slave, interviewed in 1937 at the age of 94, said something that perhaps captured the truth better than any official record. "We told that story to our children to teach them 2 things. First, that the system would break you if it could, would reduce you to nothing, would make you less than human if you let it. And second, that even when you're small, even when you're damaged, even when they tell you you're only worth 8 cents, you still got power if you know how to use it." That boy, he used what he had, used his size, used his knowledge, used the very machine they made him tend. He paid back what was owed, then he ran. Didn't make it far, didn't live free for long, but he died on his terms. Sometimes that's all you get. The copper pennies found in the cabin were never preserved as evidence. They were distributed among the railroad workers who'd discovered the site, carried off as curiosities, eventually lost or spent or thrown away. 8 cents scattered to the winds, their symbolic weight forgotten by everyone except those who knew why they mattered. In the end, the story of Small Thomas asks questions that 1851 Georgia couldn't answer, and that perhaps we still struggle with today. What is justice in a system built on injustice? What is murder when life itself has been stolen? What is freedom worth to someone who's been told they're worth less than pocket change? And what becomes of a child who learns that the only way to reclaim his humanity is to destroy the man who denied it? The historical record provides no satisfying answers. It offers only facts: a purchase for 8 cents, a death beneath a cotton press, footprints leading into a creek, a cabin in the woods, and 8 pennies arranged in a circle around a small skeleton. The rest, the truth of what happened in those hours between midnight and dawn on September 14th, 1851, remains hidden in the same darkness that once filled the Hapeville cotton processing facility, illuminated only by flickering lanterns that have long since been extinguished. This story shows us how easily human beings can be reduced to monetary value, and how that reduction creates the conditions for violence that society then condemns while ignoring its own complicity. The 8-cent boy's name appears in only one surviving document. His crime appears in none. His grave has been paved over. But his story remains, preserved in whispers and oral histories, a reminder of what happens when we forget that every human life has worth beyond what any market assigns it. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Small Thomas acted alone, or was there a conspiracy of silence that allowed him to escape? Could Patience Freeman's account be trusted, or was it a story embellished over decades? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this tale as haunting as I did, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and share this with someone who appreciates the dark corners of American history. These are the stories they didn't teach in school, the truths buried beneath official records, the voices that history tried to silence. And we'll keep bringing them to you, one forgotten tale at a time. See you in the next video.